Welcome, folks, to week number 13 as we're continuing in our verse-by-verse journey through the Gospel of John. Today, we're picking things up at John chapter 11. John chapter 11. Now, let's remind ourselves what exactly a gospel is. Remember, it's a genre, it's a type of literature, a unique type of literature. Essentially, it is a first-century Greco-Roman biography mixed together with preaching, and that's sort of a hybrid. Like a gas and electric vehicle, a gospel is a biography and a sermon wrapped, interwoven together. The author that we believe is John, the son of Zebedee. Peter, James, and John, you know, the three who hung out with Jesus, his closest companions. This is the John, the brother of James. Peter, James, John. This is John, the son of Zebedee, who also wrote 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, and the book of Revelation as well. He was exiled on the Isle of Patmos. The context of our passage today is we're coming to the conclusion of Jesus' public ministry. And the tension between Jesus and the religious leaders has come to a boiling point. Now, the final public miracle or sign that Jesus produces in John's gospel, now let's remember, one of the things that the genre of a gospel writer could do, a first-century Greco-Roman biography, you could rearrange the events in the person's life. So it's not necessarily chronological. This is not necessarily the exact order that things happened in. You had the freedom in a first-century biography to arrange the events in their life around the theme that you're trying to communicate. But in John's gospel, this is the last sign that Jesus produces, public sign, which is the raising of Lazarus from the dead. Now, what's interesting is this. John is the only gospel writer to mention this miracle. Now, that's odd, isn't it, if you think about it? He raised somebody from the dead, and John's the only gospel writer who mentions it. It's not in Matthew, not in Mark, not in Luke. Now, why would that be? Scholars have wondered this for a long time, and one possible solution to this dilemma, if you will, and it's not really a dilemma, it's just a question. One possible solution is linked to the Apostle Peter. Now, what's interesting is this. Peter is noticeably absent from John's gospel between John 6:68 and John 13:6. So from the end of chapter 6 to the beginning of chapter 13, there's no Peter at all in the Gospel of John. That's kind of odd. Peter was sort of like the spokesperson, right? Peter disappears from the gospel after responding to Jesus' controversial statement about eating his body and drinking his blood. And then Peter reappears in the gospel on the evening of the Last Supper at the washing of the disciples' feet. Between that controversial statement and the Last Supper, there's no Peter in the Gospel of John. Now, some surmise, we don't know for sure, but some surmise that for some reason, maybe Peter remained behind in Galilee for some reason, had something he had to deal with his family perhaps, we don't know. So while the others headed up to Jerusalem, Peter stayed behind for a brief period in Galilee, and then he rejoined them for the Passover festival. That means that Peter was not present to witness the raising of Lazarus, which may explain why Thomas appears to be the spokesperson, as we'll see today, for the disciples in this passage. Now you say, okay, Darren, I'm not connecting the dots here. What does that have to do with the reason why this event is not found in the other three Gospels? Well, remember something we learned from the very beginning. There's something called the Synoptic Gospels. And synoptic, like where we get our word synonym, similar, from similar source. And the Synoptic Gospels, and then there's the Gospel of John. The Synoptic Gospels are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Okay? They have a lot of the similar material. And scholars believe, having done all this criticism, and criticism it's not a negative word, it means studying, tearing it apart and studying the words and the phrasing and so on. Most scholars believe that Mark was the first gospel written, and Matthew and Luke sourced their material from Mark. So Mark was sort of the source document, and Matthew and Luke took Mark's material and added to it and arranged it according to their theme and their unique audiences that they were all targeting. Now, what's unique about Mark is it is based upon Peter. Scholars believe that Peter was, Mark was the editor, if you will, for Peter. Peter is the source of Mark's gospel. And if Peter didn't witness the resurrection of Lazarus, he didn't mention it in Mark's gospel, which is why it was not sourced in Matthew and Luke. Okay? So that is a often given response as to why John is the only gospel that mentions the raising of Lazarus from the dead. It's possible. All right, let's get to the introduction. Number one in your outline, John sets the scene. John sets the scene. Let's read verses 1 to 3 of 11. Now a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. That hasn't happened yet in the gospel, but John's anticipating. You'll read about that. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, Lord, the one you love is sick. So here, as your outline says, John, he names the problem, the people, and the place. He names the problem, he names the people, and he names the place. Now, John is distinguishing this Bethany from the other Bethany. So, to go on the map, Sea of Galilee, Jordan River, Dead Sea, Jerusalem's about here. And this Bethany is just 2 miles, roughly, east of Jerusalem. And the other Bethany is a ways away. It's where John the Baptist was baptizing people. It was on the other side of the Jordan, Transjordan, in modern-day nation of Jordan. Okay? So he's distinguishing between the Bethany, which is just over the Mount of Olives, and the Bethany where John the Baptist was doing his work. Now, amazingly, the focus of this story is more upon the sisters of Lazarus than upon Lazarus himself. Lazarus never says a word. Okay? Notice that the sisters don't specifically request Jesus come. Their request is more implied, and they seem to be hoping that Jesus is going to do something. Now, the sisters were likely aware, I'm sure they were aware, of the tension that was present in their area regarding Jesus and the Jewish leaders. So they knew Jesus was avoiding that area at that time, and he was avoiding that area at that time. So they were in metropolitan Jerusalem, if you can think in those terms. So they realized things were pretty tense, and Jesus was avoiding that area. So it would have been a big ask, perhaps, in their mind, to have Jesus come to put himself in danger. Let's read verse 4. When Jesus heard this, Jesus said, "This sickness will not end in death. No, it's for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it." As your outline says, number 2, Jesus is not saying that Lazarus will not die as a result of the sickness. Jesus is saying that death will not be the final stage of the sickness. He's not saying he won't die. He's saying that it won't be the final stage. Read it again. When he heard this, Jesus said, "This sickness will not end in death. No, it's for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it." Now, as your outline says, God's glory refers to the manifestation of God's perfect nature, his perfect nature. Years ago here at Broadway, I don't know if it's still available on our website. I'm sure it might be. If not, we can put it up there. We did a series. I can't even remember the name of the series now. But we did some code. I think we call it the Bible, cracking the Bible code or something like that, where we took some key phrases in the Bible and explained what they meant. The name of the Lord, the glory of God, anointing. These are phrases, and we unpack them. What do they mean, biblically speaking? And glory refers to the moral perfection of God, the absolute perfection of God. We likened it to, as I remember, the shine on a car. When you wax your car, why is your car shinier after you wax it? Because the wax fills in the cracks on the surface of your vehicle. It flattens the surface of your vehicle so the sun will directly bounce off of it. It's a smoother, more perfect nature of the surface of your vehicle. Well, that's sort of like the glory of God. It's bright, it's shining because the light bounces off of it perfectly. It is a perfect moral being is God. And look what verse 4 is saying about Jesus. Sickness will not end in death. No, it's for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it. The perfection of the Son will be revealed. As your outline says, to be. Jesus is saying that he will reflect God's perfection through this event. If this isn't true, this is blasphemy. He will reflect God's perfection. That's like me saying, I hope you folks join us for the second service. I'm preaching today, and my words are going to, God's going to be glorified. The perfection of God is going to be shown through my life today at 11:15. You need to be there. You're thinking, whoa, Darren. Back off, Charlie, here. You've got you've got some issues. But unless it's true, and it's not, ask my wife. She'll tell you. In fact, this sense of Jesus being the reflection of God's perfection, the writer of Hebrews in Hebrews 1:3 wrote this: the Son is the radiance of God's glory. Just like sunbeams come from the sun, the writer of Hebrews says that Jesus is radiating the perfection of God. And the Son is the exact representation of his being. What? Sustaining all things by his powerful word. And after he provided purifications for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the majesty in heaven. Again, when people say, the Bible doesn't say that Jesus is God, what? Read that. It's incredible. All right, number 3 in your outline. Before describing Jesus' actions, John makes Jesus' love for the family very clear. Before describing the actions, he makes Jesus' love for the family very clear. Read verse 5. Now, Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. Okay? And that word love, surprise, surprise, is agape. Now, sometimes we're left wondering, why does God do things the way that he does things? Now, one thing we never have to wonder about, by the way, is whether or not God loves us. Interestingly, in verse 3, the sister sent word to Jesus, Lord, the one you love is sick. That word is not agape, it's phileo. It's a word for brotherly love, friendly love. Your best buddy, the one that you have deep friendship for. Okay, and then it says later in verse 5 that Jesus agape'd these women. Well, so why does God do things the way he does them? Well, with this mystery in mind as to why God does things the way that he does them, read the next verses 6 and 7. So, when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he rushed immediately to his side. That's not what it says. When he heard Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. And then he said to his disciples, let's go back to Judea. What is going on? As your outline says, number 4, upon hearing the news, Jesus delays for 2 days. He delays for 2 days. Why the delay? A couple things on your outline. Letter A. Jesus is never moved by external forces, such as pleas from family or friends. That's not why he does things the way he does them. He's never moved by external forces. Remember his first miracle, his mother. Hey, can you do something? Woman, why are you bringing this to me? My time's not ready yet. Okay? As your outline says, he only responds to the Father's direction and the Father's timing. He only responds to the Father's direction and the Father's timing. Letter B in the box in your outline. Perhaps Jesus delayed to ensure there would be no doubt Lazarus was truly deceased. Perhaps that's why he delayed. So there'd be no doubt Lazarus was truly dead. Otherwise, his critics, because to this day there are some people saying, well, Jesus wasn't really dead on the cross. Maybe he just went into a little coma or he fainted. And imagine what they would have said here if he'd gone right away and Lazarus had only been in the tomb a couple of hours. Well, Lazarus probably wasn't really dead. But perhaps Jesus is waiting to ensure there's no doubt. No, the guy was dead. Number 5 on your outline, Judea, he mentions Judea instead of Bethany, emphasizes the region over the village. Jesus is returning to the danger zone. That's what John's getting across. He emphasizes the region of Judea over the village of Bethany. Jesus is returning to the danger zone. This is where all the trouble is. This is headquarters for Judaism, headquarters for the Sanhedrin, headquarters, for the temple, head office. Okay. Number 6, the disciples remind Jesus of the danger that region represents. So they remind him. Read verse number 8. They remind Jesus, are you sure you want to go back there? But Rabbi, they said, a short while ago, the Jews there tried to stone you, and yet you're going back? You're going back to Judea? Seriously? Don't you want to think this through? Read verses 9 and 10. Jesus answered, are there not 12 hours of daylight? Anyone who walks in the daytime will not stumble, for they see by this world's light. It is when a person walks at night that they stumble, for they have no light. Now, Jesus is using an illustration here from the common reckoning of time in the first century. In the day before people had watches, both the Romans and the Jews divided the daylight into 12 hours. And those 12 hours varied in length according to the season. Unlike our reckoning of time, 1 hour is always 60 minutes, no matter what time of year. It's 60 minutes in December, it's 60 minutes in July. An hour is 60 minutes. Not so in the first century. The length of the hour was determined by the time of the year, by the time of sunlight. So think in these terms. If let's say when's the darkest time of the year here? Between November and June? Let's say December, okay? So December, there's that much sunlight, okay? Between there and there, there's that much sunlight. And let's say in July, there's that much sunlight. Back then, this would be divided into 12, and that's not 12. I'm not going to spend the time of counting out 12. And then this would be counted out as 12. So 12 hours there, 12 hours there. So they would just take however much daylight you had, divide it into 12. However much daylight you had, divide that into 12. That's how they reckoned time back then, okay? So you have 12 hours of daylight, whether it be the winter or whether it be the summer. So the hour would be shorter depending on the time of year. And during those 12 daylight hours, people did their work. And once the darkness came, you stopped working. It's not as though they had lights and electricity and so on. Couldn't get a lot done by candles, okay? So on the surface level, what Jesus is saying is pretty obvious. The world's light refers to the sunlight. But clearly, Jesus means more than that. He's essentially saying, as your outline says, as long as we are walking in the light, physically, spiritually, we have nothing to fear. That's what he's essentially saying. As long as we're walking in the light, we have nothing to fear. Let's read verse 11. After he had said this, he went on to tell them, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to wake him up. As your outline says, sleep, while not common, was not unheard of as a term for death at that time. So it wasn't common in the Jewish vernacular, but it wasn't unheard of as a term for death at that time. Now, this should not be confused with the modern concept of soul sleep that some people teach, teaching that when a person dies, that they are simply asleep, they are unconscious, and they are raised to consciousness again at the resurrection. That is not what the Jewish concept of death was. The Jewish concept of death was, and still remains, that a person is conscious after death. So you don't cease to be conscious. You're still conscious. Your spirit is disembodied, and you are in the presence of God, conscious. Think of the parable Jesus told about the rich man and Lazarus, a different Lazarus from today. And when they both died, they both went down into Abraham's bosom. They're talking and they're communicating. They're conscious. They're not asleep. They're conscious. Now, it's not always wise to base an entire doctrine upon a parable, but there are other examples as well, I would think, in Scripture where this concept of Jewish thinking that you're still aware, you're conscious after your death. Number 9, the disciples once again misunderstand what Jesus is saying. Again, they misunderstand what he's saying. Read verses 12 and 13. The disciples replied, Lord, if he sleeps, he'll get better. Jesus had been speaking of his death, but his disciples thought he meant natural sleep. Number 10 in your outline. So Jesus is blunt. And his response shows that belief is a progressive thing. By that, I don't mean progressive in the political context. I mean progressive in it moves forward. It has a direction to it. Read verses 14 and 15. So then, he told them plainly, all right, folks, listen, Lazarus is dead. And for your sake, I'm glad I was not there, so that you may believe. Let us go to him. Now, what is he saying there? So I'm glad I wasn't there, so you may believe. Were they not already believers? These men had left everything, and women had left everything to follow him. They were already believers to some degree, yet in the near future, they would abandon him. So faith is something that fluctuates and grows. Jesus knows what is about to take place, and he knows that him raising Lazarus from the dead is going to make their faith stronger. So he says, I'm glad I wasn't there so that I didn't heal him before he died. I'm glad he has died because I know what you're about to witness is going to increase your faith. Read verse 16. Then Thomas, again, normally this is Peter speaking, right? But then Thomas, known as Didymus, which means a twin, said to the rest of the disciples, this is Eeyore speaking, let's also go so we can die with him. Thomas is a glass half empty kind of a guy, right? All right, so then we get to the event. B1 on your outline. The fact of Lazarus's, yeah, good. Seeing if you're paying attention. Number 11. Thomas somehow manages to express doubt and courage at the same time. He is a uniquely gifted guy. He expresses doubt and courage at the same time. Let's go with him. He's courageous, so we can die with him. B1. The fact of Lazarus' death is established. The fact that Lazarus is dead is established. On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. So let's do the math here. Lazarus has been in the tomb. Do it over here. He's been in the tomb for 4 days. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay? It would have taken 1 day for them to get to Jesus from Bethany. Jesus waits 2 days, and it would have taken 1 day for Jesus to get from where he was to Bethany. Okay? So essentially, as you piece it together, in Jewish life, to this day still, you're buried the day that you die. The day that you die, you're buried. So what it appears is they left in the morning to tell Jesus, Lazarus is sick. When they left, Lazarus was sick. After they left, he died. He was placed in the tomb on that day. In fact, you read it when they come to Jesus, and Jesus just been told he's sick, but Jesus says, no, he's dead. He knows that Lazarus is already dead. Okay? Jesus waits 2 days. Then Jesus takes the day and travels 4 days in the tomb. That's how that works out when you do the math. Okay? Number 2. So the fact that Lazarus is dead has been established. The guy has been in the tomb for 4 days. Number 2, the fact that this is a public event close to the home of Jesus' enemies is established. Okay? The fact that this is a public event close to the home of Jesus' enemies is established. Read verses 18 and 19. Now, Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. Okay? Now, the sisters of Lazarus re-enter the story after first having sent word to Jesus. So back then they send word to Jesus. Now Jesus comes and they re-enter the story. Verse 20. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. Now there's a typo on your outline here. I've typed incorrectly. It should read, when Martha seems to be the spontaneous, energetic extrovert, Martha is the spontaneous, energetic extrovert, while Mary, that's the typo, Mary seems to be the conservative, relaxed introvert. Admittedly, you can't psychoanalyze from 2,000 years away. But when you look at Luke chapter 10, 38 to 40, that's the other time Jesus had interacted with Mary and Martha. And remember, Martha was busy hosting all these people in her home and preparing the meal. And she's really frustrated and agitated because Mary, her sister's out in the living room sitting at Jesus' feet listening to him talk. And she's upset. Like, I'm doing all the work here and Mary's sitting around and behind doing nothing. What's up with this, Jesus? And so when you kind of piece it together, Martha's there going to greet Jesus. Mary stays back this time at home with the others. So Martha seems to be the energetic extrovert. Mary's the conservative, relaxed introvert, it appears. Read verses 21 to 22. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. Now this is a tricky passage. One could assume that Martha is asking or anticipating that Jesus is going to raise her brother from the dead. That's what it looks like, doesn't it? However, when you see her reaction to Jesus' command to take away the stone in verse 39, you get the impression that she wasn't anticipating a miracle at all. Jesus says, remove the stone, and she says, and I love the King James Version, but he stinketh. Lord, remove the stone, like he's going to stink in there. Like, why are you asking him to do this? He's dead. He's in there. He's dead. So it doesn't appear she's anticipating a miracle. But number 4 in your outline, in the midst of her grief, Martha appears to be expressing regret mixed with trust. So in the midst of her grief, and we've all been there, she's expressing regret mixed with trust. She's grieving, she's believing, she's confused, she doesn't know what to think. All I know is, Lord, that if you'd been here, he wouldn't have died, but I'm not offended. I still know you can do whatever you want. God, the Father, will give you whatever you ask. But that doesn't imply she's saying, so please raise him from the dead. She's just simply saying, I don't know what to think. Read verses 23 to 24. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha answered, I know he'll rise again in the resurrection at the last day. This is crucial. As your outline says, number 5, Martha takes Jesus' words as a common expression of comfort at a funeral. She takes his words as common expression of comfort at a funeral. We've all been there. We've all said the words. We've all heard the words. And they're good words. But we're trying to comfort someone about, we'll see them again someday. It's good to know that they're in the presence of God, and comforting words. And so that's what she takes Jesus' words as. Your brother will rise again. She says, yeah, I know, in the very last day when everyone else is resurrected, he'll be resurrected too. It's important to grasp this because Martha is expressing what every Jewish man and woman believed and still believe for the most part. There will be one resurrection at the end of time. See, I know he'll be resurrected at the last day. That's what every Jew believed. There's only one mass resurrection at the end of history. This is what made Jesus' resurrection such an unanticipated event. Whenever we teach on the apologetic for the resurrection of Jesus, we point out that that's why when Jesus said the Son of Man will go to Jerusalem and be handed over to the Gentiles and the Jewish leaders, he'll be crucified and he will be raised on the third day. And they're going, well, what does that even mean? That's some symbolic talk. Can't mean he'll be resurrected because that doesn't happen until the end of history. So I don't know what he's saying. It's another parable. Because it was a completely unanticipated event, Jesus' resurrection. And it's also important to not confuse things here. You're saying, well, if there's only one resurrection at the end of time, then why is Lazarus being resurrected here? And how is Jesus called the first fruits of the resurrection if Lazarus was resurrected before Jesus was? Because Lazarus wasn't resurrected. What do you mean he wasn't resurrected? He was dead, now he's alive. No, he was resuscitated. He wasn't resurrected. Resurrection is when you are raised to life to never die again. You're raised to life with a glorified, Spirit-infused, Holy Spirit-infused body. A supernatural, natural hybrid body. That's a resurrection body. The body that can be in the heavenly dimension and the earthly physical dimension. Lazarus was just given his old body back again. He wasn't given a new resurrected body. Just like the widow's son that was raised from the dead wasn't resurrected. There's a difference between raising from the dead and resurrected from the dead. Jesus is the first fruits of the resurrection. No one had ever been resurrected before and has been resurrected since. Lazarus isn't resurrected. He's revived, or revivification. He was revived. He came back to life, okay? Not resurrected. Then, in verse 25, Jesus utters the fifth of 7 I am statements in John's gospel. Remember the famous, in Exodus chapter 3, God says to or to Moses says, who should I say sent me? They're going to ask, who sent you? If I go to them in Egypt, God said, tell them I am has sent you. It's the name for Yahweh, where they get the word Yahweh. And Jesus uses this phrase many times. The one time he says it directly. Before Abraham was, I am. And they picked up stones to stone him. How dare you use that name? But then Jesus then tied it many times. He said, I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the door. I am the good shepherd. I am the way and the truth and the life. I am the true vine. I am the resurrection and the life. Jesus claims simply to be I am. Okay? Number 7. Jesus essentially asks Martha if she's living a Christ-centered life. In our vernacular here at Broadway, that's what he's saying in verse 26. He says, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? He's essentially saying, are you living a Christ-centered life? Are you believing in me? Are you putting your trust in me, Martha? And then, number 8 in your outline, Martha declares her belief as she understands what each term means. Keep in mind, your understanding of the term she uses is much greater than her understanding at that moment. Verse 27. Yes, Lord, she replied, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who has come into the world. Now, I highly doubt that when she said you're the Son of God, she had the full understanding, you are God in flesh. I don't think her understanding fully of what the Son of God meant back then is as full as you and I understand it today. But she expresses her belief as she understood those terms at that time. As well, Messiah. She would not have been thinking, you're going to come and die in our place and take our sin. That wasn't the concept of the Messiah. Remember, the concept of the Messiah was a political ruler going to come and destroy those dirty Romans and set up Israel once again in Jerusalem. So she's saying, I believe you're the one who's going to come and restore Israel. So she believed rightly he was the Messiah. She believed rightly she was the Son of God. But her understanding of those two terms weren't as full as they would be today for her. Then number 9, Martha leads Mary to Jesus, and her response, Mary's response, is identical. The responses are identical. Let's start at verse 28. After she had said this is Martha, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. The teacher's here, she said, and is asking for you. When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now, Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who had been with Mary in the house, comforting her, noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. You can tell the theme of the conversations they've been having for the last 4 days, can't you? If only Jesus had been here. Let's keep reading in verse 33. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Where have you laid him? He asked. Come and see, Lord, they replied. And then the shortest verse in the Bible, Jesus wept. That phrase, deeply moved, 2 words in English. It's one word in ancient Greek. And it's the word for the snorting of a horse. It's a word for the horse when a horse does that. Or it's a word for displaying anger or outrage or emotional indignation. That's the word. And in spirit means in himself, inward reaction. So he was deeply moved. He was like angered, outraged in himself. So what's going on here? And why is Jesus weeping? Jesus was not grieving for Lazarus. because he knew what he was about to do in like the next minute or two. Okay? Number 10, Jesus was angered at the waves of sin, death, and unbelief all around him. Not so much angry at them as individuals, but just it appears he's angry at what sin has done to creation. Deep within him, he's snorting of a horse. He's angry, he's outraged, emotional indignation. He's troubled by it. Read verses 36 and verse 37. So it's Jesus looking around, he's seeing all this grief, all this pain, this agony, the separation that sin brings. It just moves him. Verses 36 and 37. Then the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind have kept this man from dying? Couldn't he come and healed him off of his sick bed?" See how short-sighted they are. So Jesus was saying, I got something even bigger than raising him off a sick bed. I'm going to take him out of a tomb. So, number 11, the crowd fails to grasp what was truly going on. The crowd fails to grasp what was truly going on here. Oh, look how much Jesus loved Lazarus. That's not really why he was weeping, it appears. And number 12, Jesus publicly raises Lazarus from the dead. He publicly raises Lazarus from the dead. Read verses 38 to 44. Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. "Take away the stone," he said. "But Lord," said Martha, the sister of the dead man, "by this time there's a bad odor, for he's been there 4 days." Then Jesus said, "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, "Father," here's where he's praying publicly. Remember this if you haven't heard the sermon yet today. He publicly prays, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." Then the response in your outline, C1, many responded by putting their faith in Jesus. Many responded by putting their faith in Jesus. Look at verse 45. Therefore, many of the Jews who had come to visit Mary had seen what Jesus did, believed him. Many who had come to visit Mary and had seen what Jesus did, believed in him. So many put their faith in Jesus. But number 2, C2, others responded by running off and reporting to the Pharisees. It says in verse 46, but some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. So some believed, but they put their faith in Jesus. Others went running and reported to the Pharisees. Number 3, the Jewish religious leaders gathered to strategize. They gathered to strategize. Look, starting at verse 47. Again, they just heard word. You're not going to believe this. Lazarus in Bethany, raised from the dead. He's been in the tomb 4 days. He comes out. He's alive. It's incredible. And so how do they respond? Starting at verse 47. Then the chief priests and the Pharisees called a meeting of the Sanhedrin. We were wrong. We need to follow this person. That's not what they said. What are we accomplishing, they asked. Here is this man performing many signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him. And then, and this jumped out at me years ago as the motivation at the core for the Pharisees and Sadducees, because the Sadducees ran the Sanhedrin, not the Pharisees. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him. Why is that bad? Look at next. And then the Romans will come and take away both our temple and our nation. So, what do we learn from these verses? Actually, let's keep reading. Then one of them, named Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, spoke up. You know nothing at all. You don't realize that it is better for you that one man die for the people than that the whole nation perish. He did not say this on his own, but as high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the Jewish nation, and not only for that nation, but also for the scattered children of God, to bring them together and make them one. So from that day on, they plotted to take his life. So, as your outline says, what do we learn from this? Well, let's reread verse 47. The chief priests and the Pharisees called a meeting of the Sanhedrin. What are we accomplishing? They asked. Here is this man performing many signs. So, A, they acknowledge the power of Jesus' deeds. They acknowledge the power of his deeds. They're not in denial of the power of his deeds. Verse 48, if we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come take away our temple and our nation. So what they do, as your outline says, they prioritize their own political power. They prioritize their own political power. That's what it's all about. If we don't stop this guy, everyone's going to acknowledge him as the Messiah. The Romans are going to come thinking we're doing an uprising, which is why Jesus didn't announce he was the Messiah from the beginning. Remember, we've been pointing that out. And that's what they're saying. The Romans are going to come, and they are going to throttle us. They're going to take away our temple. They're going to take away our little Sanhedrin thing. We got a good thing going here. We got some power, political power. We're going to lose all of this. And then we read that prophecy. One of them, Caiaphas, who was the chief priest at that time, said, you know nothing at all. You don't realize that it's better for you that one man die for the people than the whole nation perish. As your outline says, the chief priest was not saying Jesus' death was necessary to save them from the power of sin. He was not saying that. He was saying Jesus' death was necessary to save them from the power of Rome. He wasn't saying his death is necessary to save them from the power of sin. He was saying his death is necessary to save them from the power of Rome. And that's all that mattered to them. Verse 53. So from that day on, they plotted to take his life. Letter D in your outline. The decision is made to put a plan together to kill Jesus. The decision is made to put a plan together to kill Jesus. And then verses 54 to 57. Therefore, Jesus no longer moved about publicly among the people of Judea. Instead, he withdrew to a region near the wilderness, to a village called Ephraim, where he stayed with his disciples. When it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, many went up from the country to Jerusalem for their ceremonial cleansing before the Passover. They kept looking for Jesus as they stood in the temple courts, and they asked one another, what do you think? Isn't he coming to the festival at all? But the chief priests and the Pharisees had given orders that anyone who found out where Jesus was should report it so that they might arrest him. So your outline says, number 4, knowing this, Jesus was even more careful regarding when and where he traveled. Knowing that they were strategizing now to kill him, he was even more careful about when and where he traveled. Next week, we're continuing in the series, and we're going to look at the triumphal entry of Jesus into Jerusalem and really begin Jesus' final week on earth.